Good evening. How are you? On behalf of Howard Gilman, our Chancellor, Enrique Lavernia, our Executive Vice Chancellor, I want to welcome you to this evening's presentation of The State of Hate, a conversation with Oren Segal, Director of the Anti-Defamation League's National Center on Extremism. It is a special evening because you are present. Some of you have traveled south from San Diego, east from the Inland Empire of Riverside and San Bernardino counties, north from LA, and many of you call Orange County or Irvine home. Your presence and attention to this evening's subject matter underscores UCI's commitment to serve as a public square for Southern California. The subject matter that brings us together is by all accounts a difficult one. The frequency and scale of crimes motivated by hate and extremism continues to rise. Locally and nationally, faith communities in particular have been targeted by individuals motivated by ideologies that regard violence as a means to advance white supremacy, the political project of neo-Nazism, among others. Just in April alone, these attacks included arson at the Dar al-Arqam Mosque in Escondido, the shooting at the Shabbat Temple in Poway, and the deliberate destruction by arson of 3 historically black churches in Louisiana. More locally, there was the savage murder of Blaise Burstein in January 2018 in Orange County, and the defacing of Irvine's Beth Jacob Temple last October, days after the mass shooting at the Tree of Light Temple in Pittsburgh. Specific populations have been and are targeted in public places, including African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and Middle Easterners. This is true as well for members of the LGBT community. It is important to recall that the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida in June 2016 represented the single deadliest incident for the LGBT community in the United States. 49 men and women were killed and another 53 wounded. I am sure that everyone in this room will agree that one hate crime is one too many. Such attacks have an explicit and insidious purpose, namely to terrorize the targeted community while dividing our society based on fear of and ignorance about our differences. In promoting the dehumanization of people, hate crimes and incidents pose an existential threat to the very fabric of our diverse society, the legitimacy of the rule of law, and the integrity of our democratic institutions. Neither turning away nor turning inward is the answer. Instead, we must lean in to learn about and from each other. Otherwise, it is virtually impossible to stand together as a diverse community to confront hate while intentionally supporting affected communities. Indeed, we are assembled this evening because we care. We care about being connected as a community. We want to be connected to promote a more resilient society, not in spite of diversity, but because of it. In this spirit, I want to ask you to be in community this evening. So take a moment and greet your neighbor to your left and right. This evening's presentation is hosted by UCI Confronting Extremism Initiative. Launched in the aftermath of the display of violent extremism in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017, this initiative seeks to harness UCI's research, teaching service mission to understand extremism and to use our insight to inform how we respond individually and collectively as a community dedicated to inclusive excellence. As Reverend Jesse Jackson and Rabbi Hillel Cohn noted more than 2 years ago here at UCI, the events in Charlottesville underscore the reality that we can no longer simply know hate when we see it or turn away in disgust. It is for this reason that the Confronting Extremism Initiative has funded faculty research on the denial of our common humanity, as well as science denialism, supported innovative pedagogical classroom practices to augment critical thinking in our lower and upper division courses, hosted public affairs programming on a range of topics such as Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, and more recently sexual assault with Tarana Burke. Finally, with general support from the Henry and Susan Samueli Foundation, the campus is piloting an ambassador program to augment the capacity for empathy among Orange County high school students. We are gifted with good partners who make this event and our ongoing efforts possible to support equity and diversity and practice inclusion and honor free speech. I want to thank Rabbi Peter Levy, who is the Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League in Orange County, for his support and coordination in bringing our speaker to UCI. I am pleased also to recognize among UCI colleagues Ade Nyamathi, Dean of the Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing, Richard Aram, Dean of the School of Education, Frank LaFurla, Dean of the School of Biological Sciences, as well as Michelle Doshman, Executive Director of the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Edward Dormitorio, Ramin Talesh, Dean of Students and Assistant Vice Chancellor of Life and Leadership. And I also want to thank so many community partners for joining us, including Josh Groshkin, the ADL Regional Board Chair, as well as representatives from the ADL. Lisa Armory, who directs the Rose Project at the Jewish Federation of Family Services, Laura Cantor, Director from the LGBT Center of OC, and colleague Maureen Dadoboy from the OC Human Relations Commission. And I also want to acknowledge Ivan Williams, Senior Vice President of Scenario Entertainment, whose work on the film This Changes Everything sheds light and important conversation about ending sexual harassment and assault in Hollywood. Please give our community partners a hand. We now come to the main event. This brings us to an engaging program for this evening. And I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Oren Segal, who is Director of the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism. The center, as noted in your program, is world-renowned for combating terrorism and all forms of hate in the real world and online. Mr. Segal is an expert on Muslim and left-wing terrorism, as well as in tracking the rise of white supremacy groups on college campuses. It is disturbing as well as sobering to note information from Oren's 60 Minutes interview in 2017 that 74% of the domestic U.S. terrorism has been carried out by white supremacists, not Islamic terrorists. Clearly, his comments today represent a broad spectrum of issues that truly are relevant to all members of our community. Mr. Segal comes from journalistic roots, evident from the succinct and informative reports issued by the Center and reflective of his former work at the New York Times. He has been recognized by the 2015 White House and the FBI for his service in the public interest. And he joins us tonight to inform us about the state of hate. Please join me in warmly welcoming Oren Segal.
Thanks so much. All right. Can you all hear me? Yes. Loud and clear? Good. What do you want to talk about? Well, it's a real honor for me to be here. Thank you all so much for coming out. The reality is when I travel around and talk about these light topics is I find myself saying how timely it is. And frankly, I've been saying that for about 4 years. Every single time I have the honor to speak in front of any audience, I'm talking about some incident or series of incidents that just occurred that underscore the need to have these important conversations. My goal today is to provide probably a little too much in the weeds, so probably to suck the air out of the room, but ultimately to have a conversation that enables you to understand some of the nuances of the issues that we're looking at, but then also talk about what can we all do to respond, because response, I think, is key. We can't let the hate, the violence be the things that are remembered in this moment in time. In fact, I think at the end of the day, it's the way that good people responded that will really win the day, and not the attacks and the hate that we see every day. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do in the Center on Extremism. I'll talk a little bit more broadly about some of the threats that we're seeing. But ultimately, I also want to be able to have a discussion with all of you. I know that there are some studies done about people's attention spans, and that the average attention span lasts about, I think, 7 minutes or so. I believe I've already lost a couple of you. So I do have a lot of images, and I can skip around. I'm not beholden to this PowerPoint presentation. But maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'll say it. If at any point you feel like you want to interrupt and ask me to expand about anything that I'm talking about, please do so. Raise your hand, and I'll call on you, because I think a discussion is important. But I do want to lay some groundwork, and I do think it's important to start with just basic data. Where are we now in terms of what we're seeing? So the Center on Extremism at ADL, we're made up of a group of incredibly talented investigators, analysts, researchers, some people who have been monitoring, exposing, and tracking extremists for over 20 years. We literally go where the hate is. And that's online, that's on the ground. They spend every single one of their waking moments, if you will, looking at how extremists talk to each other. What's their ideologies? What are the tactics that they use? But we're not just doing it to understand and become part of the public discussion. What I think makes ADL different is that we're actually trying to stop it. We're trying to disrupt extremists before they're able to carry out their attacks. Sometimes we're successful, but the volume and the challenges in terms of all the spaces, in particular online, that this hate exists, that is incubating the violence that we're seeing, I will tell you has been the greatest challenge in my 20 years of doing this work at ADL. But the staff persists. We continue to go where that hate is. And a lot of what you'll hear today is actually brought to you by the work of the incredibly passionate and talented analysts that I happen to work with every single day. They're spread throughout the country. So who are our key constituents? A lot of the information that we collect about individual extremists, these movements, we actually share that with law enforcement. And we believe that law enforcement, the more educated they are, the more information they have about emerging threats, the better we can serve to protect the security and safety of communities. And frankly, in this day and age where it seems like domestic extremism, the funding for that is getting cut in Washington every day, I will tell you that it's more important for ADL to do the work monitoring domestic extremism and sharing that with law enforcement. We also share our information with the tech industry. This is where extremism and hate begins. And increasingly, we are trying to find ways to leverage the experience and expertise that we have with those platforms who are being exploited every single day. Nobody knows how extremists talk to each other better than we do. Nobody knows the symbols that they use, and nobody knows the consequences of this more than we do. And by the way, this is both a challenge and quite controversial in terms of how do you work with an entire tech industry. There's not one size that fits all, but we'll explore that as well. And finally, through 25 regional offices around the country, ultimately we try to stand with the communities that are targeted. All the information we provide, whether it's to law enforcement, the tech industry, is about keeping communities safe. And so we do that every single day. We go where the hate is. Let's start with some data. FBI releases hate crime statistics every single year. They usually release it in November for the previous year. So this data is from November 2018, looking at 2017. And we saw a 17% increase in hate crimes around the country. This includes a 9-year high and includes specific increases for some specific communities. Anti-Muslim crimes actually was the third highest, even though it decreased a bit. And not surprisingly, like almost every single year, anti-Semitic incidents tend to lead in terms of hate crimes around the country. These are some very basic statistics. Here's the statistic that is most important. In 90 plus cities of 100,000 people or more, they report either 0 hate crimes or don't report hate crimes at all. That means the numbers that we just saw are well underestimating the level of hate crimes around the country. And part of the work that ADL does and our partners is to advocate for those 90 plus cities of 100,000 and more to report hate crimes. You need to know the numbers in order to start figuring out ways to mitigate these threats. At the end of the day, the resources, the funding, the community efforts to combat hate crimes, you need to have a baseline and you need to have those numbers. And we're going to continue to push for better hate crime reporting around the country. But hate crimes are just one set of data. Every year, the Anti-Defamation League puts out its annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. Unlike hate crimes, these do not include only crimes. These include anti-Semitic incidents such as harassment as well. So not all of these incidents that we collect are tried and true crimes. And this past year, in 2018, we had the third highest number of anti-Semitic incidents on record. In some ways, it was kind of good news. After a 57% increase from 2016 to 17, is that it decreased 5%. But what these numbers sort of on their face don't tell you is that assaults went up by 103%. Harassment increased significantly. And so while the numbers may have gone down slightly, these are still way too high. And in California in particular, the numbers increased significantly. I got to tell you, whether it's hate crimes, extremist activity, group activity, California tends to lead the way. Now, in part, this is because it's a massive population, a very diverse population. So in some ways, it's not a surprise. Every community has to take this seriously, and California clearly has a lot of work to do as well. Now, here's something a little bit different in the numbers. Every year when we put out our audit of anti-Semitic incidents, I always say, when you're looking at anti-Semitic incidents, don't assume that these are being carried out by extremists. The majority are not. I would say that's true for hate crimes as well. Your average Joe or average Jane tends to be the ones who are committing these acts of hate or anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry. But this past year, 13% of the anti-Semitic incidents that were reported to ADL were actually linked to extremists and their supporters. That's the highest percentage, if you will, since 2004. Something is happening. And in many of those cases, we saw not only that assaults went up, but that people were actually going to Jewish institutions and putting their white supremacist propaganda, for example, onto those institutions. So not every incident that we monitor is a Pittsburgh shooting, but I have to tell you, when white supremacists feel comfortable enough to walk up to a synagogue and paste their propaganda, or to a mosque, or another religious institution, we have a problem in this country. They're emboldened. They're less and less afraid of actually bringing their hatred to the communities that they're trying to target. And our numbers are just one example of that. These flyers are just some of the examples that we pull together. Imagine the impact this has on the community. We've talked about this through hate crimes for many years. A hate crime is different because of the impact it has on the entire community. Well, I remember hearing that when I first started at ADL 20 years ago, talking about how hate crimes are different. That was before we had massive amount of social media and the ability to weaponize social media. So when something happens in Orange County targeting any community, trust me, it affects those communities that are targeted around the country and around the globe. These are the messages that are being sent. There's no such thing as local anymore. Now, here's some other data that I think is even more important. When you look at extremist-related murders, we've been keeping track of this since 1970. And when you look at the numbers in the past year, we had 50 extremist-related murders in this country. 49 of them were carried out by right-wing extremists, 78% of those by white supremacists. Now, what are right-wing extremists? You have anti-government types, anti-abortion movement. There's all forms of right-wing extremists. But when 49 of the 50 in 1 year, that suggests a problematic trend. And as was mentioned in the introduction, if you look at the last 10 years, we've seen 73% of extremist-related murders in this country carried out by right-wing extremists. So we understand the conversation about terrorism in this country tends to focus on those who are inspired by ISIS or by Al-Qaeda. It's a foreign terrorist threat that we are facing. But look at the data. Look at the numbers. 73% of extremist-related murders are carried out by right-wing extremists in the past 10 years. The majority of them by white supremacists. We cannot ignore these numbers. We understand that as discussions about terrorist threats, people are used to thinking of terrorism as something that's coming from abroad. We have designated foreign terrorist entities. We don't have domestic terrorist lists in the same way. And by the way, I'm not arguing that we should, because most extremists in this country are not affiliated with any group. They're getting radicalized, usually online, instead of meeting at a bar and exchanging ideas and signing membership dues. This is all happening in the virtual space. It's hard to necessarily connect individual actors to actual groups. Let's look at some examples. You all remember Dylan Roof and the shooting at the AME Church in South Carolina. Wasn't affiliated with any one particular group. Even just recently, is it a week ago only, or 8 days ago? Another individual clearly motivated by white supremacist ideology, not affiliated with any specific group. And so designating them is difficult. And yet discussions of the attacks that are carried out in the name of white supremacy are not always considered acts of terrorism. We consider them acts of terrorism. We call them terrorism. And that's key. Yes, sir? Yes. So here's the criteria that we use. When you look at extremist-related killings, that means somebody's either motivated by an extremist ideology or is affiliated with an extremist group. And so last year, for example, we mentioned 50 extremist-related killings. The Pittsburgh shooter, while not affiliated with any group, targeted the Jewish community based on his white supremacist ideas. So for us, that's an extremist-related killing because of the individual's ideology. Then you also have incidents where somebody is actually a member of a particular group. Sovereign citizens, an anti-government group, are involved in a lot of violent crime, in particular against law enforcement. So when somebody who self-identifies as a sovereign citizen kills a law enforcement officer, we would consider that an extremist-related killing. When somebody runs over 8 people on a bike path in New York City who's inspired by ISIS, we would consider that a extremist-related murder as well. But we also consider other shootings that you may not think about. Everybody remembers the 17 people who were killed in Parkland at the school shooting. This person, there's no information suggesting that he was part of an actual extremist group. But when you look at his online footprint, when you see that he was affiliating and talking about white supremacist ideas, when you see the swastika on his backpack and gear as he went to shoot, we count that as well. But we don't count, for example, the shooting in Las Vegas, where there was no indication of any actual extremist connection, whether it was being affiliated with a group or even that motivation. And many of these attacks we just don't know. Now, if information came out, we would readjust our numbers. And some people have suggested that the Las Vegas shooting, there was some sovereign ideology affiliated with it, but since we were never able to really find credible information of that, we would not include that. I hope that answers your question. Now, a lot of the extremists that are involved in these murders, as I mentioned, are really not affiliated with any group. They're not part of any operational structure. So here are two examples. The individual to your left, white supremacist who was radicalized online, was engaging and reading some of the more popular neo-Nazi websites, and one day decides he wants to come to New York City from Baltimore to kill an African American. He takes a bus, he actually travels with a large sword, comes to New York, and first person he sees is an African American man, a little too big for him, so he moves to another person, finds a homeless African American man, and kills him with his sword. All because of this motivation that was clear once you looked at his online footprint. So again, not affiliated with a group, but a white supremacist who's willing to carry out a vicious attack based on his ideology. Also in New York, I mentioned a bike path attack by someone who's inspired by ISIS. That's the individual to your right. So again, two different ideologies. The goal is violence and hate, and it's all incubated and fomented primarily online, without ever making communication with others who support that. You know, I don't know if you're like me, but I sleep with my phone pretty much, and I'm checking it constantly. Very unhealthy, I'll admit that publicly. But this is real, right? These are digital hate groups that individuals are existing on. And maybe you could say maybe not Facebook or Twitter, but there's a whole range of social networking sites and apps and communication tools where people are existing. And that communication, that like-minded sympathizers that they're able to find, that planning, that propaganda, that organization is as real as if you're actually affiliated with a group in real life. This is why I view them as digital hate groups. And we're seeing the consequences play out every single day. Now, I want to make one note about some of the folks that we do not include, but this keeps me up at night, frankly, as much as the extremists that we look at every day. On the left is the individual who went on a shooting spree at a GOP softball game. And on the right is Sayok. Remember him before Pittsburgh? We somehow forgot about him because all the series of events occurred. He was sending bombs to George Soros, to media, to Democrats. These are people who are unaffiliated with any extremist group. Even their ideologies don't fit neatly into the ideology of any organized movement, and yet they felt their only way that they could move forward their agenda was through violence. This is what we have to be careful of as well. We can't just only focus on the extremes, but those who have political beefs. The polarization in this country is having a massive impact on those who are even just existing in that orbit. Extremist ideas operate in the same space as legitimate news these days, and it's harder to tell the difference between the two. And it's having an impact on those who will never even consider interacting with those who are sort of on the official extremist spectrum, if you will. And so we remain concerned about these folks as well, because Sayok was motivated to some degree by a conspiracy that George Soros was somehow funding the caravan that was coming from Mexico. That is a classic anti-Semitic trope. There's no real evidence to that. And here's somebody who felt the only way they could do something about it was to send bombs to those who were reporting on it and those who he believed were in support. And here's another individual. I looked at his Facebook page. Frankly, it looks like a lot of people that I know that are very, very liberal, maybe more liberal in many ways than I, but there was no indication of any extremist narrative, and yet this person, the only way that he felt he could make a difference was to shoot up a GOP softball game. Violence and extremism and hate are becoming normal even beyond the extremist circles that we're looking at. Now, what's motivating those who are responsible for so many of the extremist-related murders, so many of the headlines that we see? It used to be white supremacists were about maintaining control in this country. They kind of had it good back in the day. They wanted to keep it that way. Now the narrative is shifting, and one of their key mottos are the 14 words that you'll see up here. We must secure the existence of our race and a future for white children. That's what they believe. It's no longer about maintaining power. It's about fighting for their existence. And if you think that you're fighting for your existence, you will do anything to defend yourself, your children, and your people. They literally tattoo this all over their bodies. They sign off on social media posts with this. This is the crux of their belief. But what does that belief lead to? What are they in opposition to? Diversity, multiculturalism, PC culture. They literally put it on their signs, as you can see. They believe that these are the elements that are there to undermine their white identity. And by the way, in their worldview, the Jews control all of this. So when Robert Bowers in Pittsburgh is focused on this anti-immigrant narrative, he shoots people at a synagogue because he believes that they are responsible for the browning of America. The demographic shifts that we're seeing, the inability for white people to maintain a majority in this country, the jobs that they're taking. Think of all the narratives that we see play out in the mainstream media every day. White supremacists celebrate that and ultimately blame the Jews for that. And we've seen deadly consequences more than once. It used to be kind of easy to spot a white supremacist. At least in this case, this guy literally has it written on his face. You kind of know what you're going to get when you see this guy. But part of their tactic is to change the way that they look. And by the way, this is not new. Y'all remember David Duke, who ran for office, for Senate, back in the day in Louisiana? He also was, wearing a suit and tie. But now they're really focused on trying to sort of tone down some of the more blatant rhetoric, some of them, to try to cast as wide a net as possible. And by the way, why are they doing that? In part, maybe it's to fool people, but it's also to try to leverage, I think, a lot of alienation in this country. Listen, you don't have to be a minority to feel alienated in the United States. And, we could do a whole 4 hours on this, but I was told that the most common occupation in 32 states is driving. So I hope this is not fake news. I didn't check the stats. But let's just assume it's something like that, 28 states. Why do I mention this? Why am I digressing in a weird sort of area? Well, if you think about sort of these self-driving cars that are going to be coming into existence, what are these people who drive Ubers and trucks and delivery and all that, what are they going to do? What kind of jobs are they going to get? What are the drivers that bring people to accept these stereotypes and these ideas that blame others for their lot in life? That's what we need to focus on. You're not born a white supremacist. You're not born an ISIS supporter. You're not born a sovereign citizen. But what we're all born with is needing a sense of belonging, wanting to be able to provide, wanting to become something bigger than ourselves. And when you feel like you don't have those options, or it's all stacked against you, you're going to find ways to explain your situation away. And as I told you before, legitimate news operates in the same space as extremist narrative. It's much more easy to find. And it's much more easy to find people who will help explain your alienation away. That's what these guys are doing, not just because they're dressing differently. They're not, shaving their heads, they're not wearing tattoos all over their body. But they're trying to feed on people's insecurities. They're trying to do it in a very tactical way. And frankly, they're getting really good at it. And where are these counter messages? Where are the places that explain that away? They're beating us at the communication game, period. Now, the alt-right, and that was Richard Spencer, head of the alt-right, obviously made a lot of news prior to Charlottesville. We sort of saw this slowly brewing. This doesn't come out of nowhere. This comes out from, frankly, an online culture. You all familiar with Gamergate, where women started being harassed, who were reporting on sort of the gaming industry? That's a short, kind of not 100% great way to articulate that. But essentially, you had these primarily young, social media savvy, open to sort of white supremacist ideas, weaponizing social media throughout 2016. We did a report because journalists started coming to us and saying, every time I report on this presidential candidate Trump, or every time I report on misogyny or anti-Muslim bigotry or anti-Semitism, I'm getting harassed and I'm getting doxxed. You all know what doxing is? Where people put your name, your address, the names of your family, your kids online in hopes that people sort of find that and harass you. So they were coming to us saying, what do we do about it? What are you seeing? And we saw a whole subculture online that was sort of devoted to these alt-right ideas, that was focusing their attention on those who were reporting the news. The effort was to try to silence them. When journalists in this country feel that they need to reconsider their occupation, that's a sign that the significance of this online activity by the far right, by the extreme right, is having an impact. We did an analysis of those Twitter accounts in this case that were harassing these journalists. And we did sort of a word cloud. These are how people defined and described themselves on their Twitter account. Now just Twitter, right? This didn't include all the other social media platforms. The bigger the word, the more commonly it was used in their description of themselves. And what do you find? Trump, nationalist, conservative, white, American. That's essentially the definition of the alt-right. So these are people who are trying to weaponize their social media in order to harass and silence those who are reporting on those issues. And that's where the alt-right started gaining steam. This is before they sort of came out, started showing their faces on the ground. And so increasingly, they came out of the shadows. Here's a group from, it's now called the American Identitarian Movement, formerly known as Identity Europa. And you can see, they're trending younger. They are more socially savvy. People used to talk about how great ISIS and Al-Qaeda were in terms of leveraging social media. They were sort of ahead of the game. I got news for you. Our domestic extremists, our white supremacists are completely catching up. And one of the ways that we see, one of the ways that we measure the impact of this is how many of them are willing to show their faces. I mean, here's a gathering at a university in Tennessee for white supremacists. They took a picture of themselves wearing their shirts and ties. Just last week, this is around the Poway shooting. In Washington, D.C., members of this group decided to harass people who came to hear a book reading. They're getting more comfortable being seen. It's not good news when white supremacists feel more and more comfortable to attend events and show their faces. Safe to say, right? Again, this is all part of a broader tactic. National Socialist Movement is one of the most sort of well-known white supremacist organizations in the country. It's been around for a long time. It's one of the largest when you're looking at actual groups that exist. Look what they did in 2016. They changed the way their flag looked. Because a swastika, we all kind of know what that means. You see a swastika, you probably don't want to hang out with that person, right? You change it to something a little more nuanced, a little bit more obscure. This is a Othello rune that white supremacists often use. And people might be interested. Well, I don't know what this is about. So again, not just the suit and ties, but literally the iconography that they're using is changing to mainstream their message. Now, not all of them. Like any movement, there's a backlash to a backlash. And we've seen specific white supremacist groups who are not embracing this concept of sort of toning down the rhetoric a little bit or toning down the way that they appear. Atomwaffen Division, one of the most violent organizations in this country, creates an entire online experience for those who they want to radicalize. They've been involved in multiple murders throughout the country, including, as was mentioned before, Blaise Bernstein in this area. And again, it's all about creating that social media experience. You know, I learn about new technology essentially from two different places, from extremists and from my 7-year-old son, right? They are the early adapters to this technology. And creating that experience, knowing that you're able to reach people in a different way, is again something they're doing particularly well. And it's starting increasingly to have an impact on the ground. You know, here's just an example of an anti-Semitic flyer that was posted by this group, Vanguard America, who has since changed its name. The same group is responsible for hanging up this banner, if you will, at a Holocaust memorial at a synagogue in New Jersey. And this one is interesting because it really has all the hallmarks of a variety of forms of anti-Semitism. So Hebes is an epithet used against Jews. You all recognize the 3 parentheses around that word? So that's an online code. It's called the echo symbol. And online for a period of time, white supremacists were putting those 3 parentheses around individuals or ideas to identify that they were Jewish. Right? It's kind of, might be complicated, but essentially, if they wanted to sort of out somebody for being Jewish or use the Jewishness of an individual to make some sort of broader claim, they would put those parentheses around their name. Now, this was eventually ultimately co-opted by a lot of Jewish individuals who all sort of put that around their name online, and so it sort of diffused it a little bit, sort of took that symbol back. I mean, I tweeted a pastrami sandwich with the echo symbol around it multiple times, and so I think, you know, people got the idea. But again, these are code words that are used by extremists online. In some ways, it's to sort of avoid detection, but in other ways, it's to leverage the technology that is available. Now, Hebes will not divide us, kind of sounds like the Jews will not replace us, and then the website and the moniker of that particular white supremacist group. Here are some flyers that we're seeing throughout the country. Again, these are all white supremacist flyers. Notice, again, some of the language is not quite as blatant as we've seen elsewhere. Take your country back. Let's become great again. That sounds familiar. You know, not seeing the America you want, start changing today. Some are more blatant than others. But at first blush, somebody's walking, you know, across the quad or walking down some public space may not know exactly what that's intended for. And by the way, this is also being crowdsourced. You can just upload your flyers, your propaganda anywhere, and anybody can download it, frankly, anywhere around the country, anywhere around the world. And so it's easy and cheap. It costs nothing to create and design this online and have people download it. And it makes it seem like there's a movement that's happening around the country, even though the creator may have never left their parents' basement. You know, here are 2 flyers that were created by the neo-Nazi website, The Daily Stormer. One says, you know, in response to the incident recently in Chicago, all hate crimes are hoaxes. The other one essentially blaming Jews for the way that Kavanaugh was dealt with. And so these are just uploaded. Next thing you know, they start appearing in 15 to 20 different states in the public area. This is what I mean by crowdsourcing. There are spaces online where propaganda and hatred is developed, and others are able to easily access it. And in some cases, we don't know who's behind it. Maybe there's somebody who just wants to mess with the local community, isn't really a white supremacist. The impact is the same. Whatever their intent is, the impact is the same. So around this time, we're seeing a growth in specific narratives. Take our country back. Islam is the problem. We saw rallies around 2016 and 17 in front of mosques around the country with people who were arming themselves as people were going to pray. The idea was, for many of these, it's not only anti-Muslim bigots, it's an entire anti-government groups, in particular, a group of them, started focusing on the Muslim community. They bought into this notion that all Muslims are terrorists. And they started showing up in front of their mosques. Again, this is developing online and showing up on the ground. There's no better example of this than Charlottesville, which I know you all heard about not too long ago. At a time where anti-immigrant rhetoric became normalized, anti-Muslim rhetoric became accepted, and frankly, misogyny became part of the day-to-day conversation, this is one of the drivers that enabled all these diverse white supremacist groups who generally never got along with each other to come together in this moment in time. And again, let's not forget, at the end of the day, what was the lasting refrain? It was the Jews will not replace us. And I mention that because, Deborah Lipstadt has said that anti-Semitism starts with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. And the same is true for every form of hatred. When anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric, misogyny, and any other form of bigotry gets normalized, it's bad for every single community. This is why we have to combat all these hates at the same time. Our analysis of those who showed up, by the way, demonstrated that people from 36 states were willing to come to Charlottesville, at least 36 states. And by the way, that also included people from other countries who all showed up in this moment in time. People were willing to travel far and wide because they felt comfortable in this moment in time to show their faces. Now, I want to make a couple of points about those who oppose them in the streets. Now, this is not a good people, bad people on both sides moment at all. There are a collection of individuals, some call themselves anti-fascists, others who just, oppose Nazis, and by the way, I oppose Nazis, who find that the only way to stop Nazis from taking over is to physically confront them in the street, right? It's to punch them in the face. It's to fight with them. And that has created, I think, a much more complicated scenario, in particular for law enforcement who's tasked with keeping the peace, but also in this concept of, there's bad guys and good guys on both sides, right? It's easy to sort of dismiss that. I reject that notion completely, but I will say that when you have individuals who are willing to punch Nazis in the face, even if deep down inside in the privacy of your own home, you kind of get a little bit of a laugh or you kind of appreciate it, ultimately it does no good. Because when you're punching Nazis in the street, you're basically feeding into their victimization mentality. They will say, see, we're not allowed to speak. We have no rights. We are being marginalized. We are under attack. And even though it might have felt good for that moment, for somebody who may have engaged in that, we cannot normalize violence even against those who we oppose. So I just want to be clear about that, because this has complicated the conversation in this country to the degree where you hear people talking about the alt-left. There is no alt-left. It doesn't exist. And most people who show up at these white supremacist events over a period of time are there in pure opposition to tell them that the community does not appreciate what they stand for and that they do not represent them. But there's a handful of people who have engaged in violence, and again, it only feeds into the narrative of the extremists. Now, one of the things that we do is to publish our analysis, our findings of the trends that we're seeing. I mentioned misogyny a couple times, so I want to just focus on this one report. You'll see it in red, it kind of stands out, because I think it's really important. I was at a conference at Yale University, and there was a speaker, and she was saying, you know, groups like ADL, they do some good work combating extremism, but when are we going to start considering misogyny the same way we consider anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-LGBT, etc.? I was like, you know, she just called us out. So what do you do when somebody calls you out? Try to have a conversation with them. Try to hear a little bit more. So I was engaging with her. I was like, you know, I was really struck by what you said. And you're right. And so last year, we doubled down on this concept that if you're trying to understand the drivers of hatred, especially white supremacy, I would say, we need to understand the role of misogyny. It's a gateway into other forms of extremism from across the ideological spectrum. We've seen white supremacists who have literally, those who have become white supremacists through these sort of misogynistic networks online. And we have seen violence from the increasing sort of organization of misogynistic elements. Anybody here hear of the incel movement? Okay. So around that 9 days surrounding the Pittsburgh shooting, we had a lot of terrible incidents that occurred. I mentioned the bombs being sent by SIOC. We had 2 African Americans who were killed at a grocery store in Kentucky, where that individual said to allegedly to one of the white bystanders, white people don't kill other white people. And apparently that person who killed them also tried to get into an African American church, but the doors were locked. Well, there was another incident that I think gets downplayed during those 9 days. 2 women were killed at a yoga studio in Tallahassee by an individual who self-identified, again, based on his social media, as an incel, an involuntary celibate, for those of you who don't know. And what is involuntary celibate? It is just what it sounds like, right? Somebody who's not able to get what they want from women. But this movement is now coalesced online to a degree where we have seen violent activity associated with it. I mentioned Tallahassee. There were also several women who were killed in a run-over attack in Toronto last year by an involuntary celibate. So as people who are making an honest effort to understand the drivers of extremism, whether it's a significant movement that is emerging or whether it's drivers and gateways into other forms of hate, misogyny is clearly something that we need to start treating the way we do racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hate. Question? The UC Santa Barbara killing from 5 or 6 years ago? Correct. Yes. That was pretty much the first incel murder that we saw in this country. And in our statistics that we keep on extremist-related murders, we are now tracking incel murders as well. So part of our job is not just to understand where this is happening, but to try to prevent it. This is where we work with law enforcement. We train law enforcement around the country. And people might say, well, why does law enforcement come to you? Don't they know these things? So here's kind of a little secret. Like, I don't have to get permission to do anything that I do as part of ADL. I don't need to get a warrant. I don't need to get like a court order. I can collect information on anybody I want, whenever I want, and I never have to expunge my records the way that law enforcement agencies do. This is why I work at ADL. I can just collect as much information as I want, but I can also, as the subway ride in New York City tells me every day, see something and say something. So we see a lot of information about extremist threats, and we share that. Here's an example, small example. I'm not going to provide information on sort of ongoing cases, or maybe just a little. So here in February 2017, this individual is arrested in South Carolina, and he says he's going to do a Dylan Roof, the Charleston shooter, style attack. He talked about a synagogue. First thing that we do is look in our files, what do we have? It's kind of incredible, again, because we don't have to get rid of our records, what we were able to find relatively quickly. It's amazing what people will post on social media about themselves. Forgive me if this is off color, we call this the dumbass factor. It's amazing what people will post about themselves. We literally found images of this individual being measured for a Klan robe. That kind of seals the deal, right? He was engaging in a naturalization ceremony for the Klan. We were able to literally place him as part of a movement. So this is the type of information we share every day. Here's an ongoing case. And I'll just say it's in Pennsylvania. Individual not only draws, murder the Juden, the Jews, all Jews must die. The sharing of memes, the sharing of these ideological sort of ideas through imagery is a key. He has these stickers of swastikas and of sort of a classic Jewish person and literally posts them on a Judaica store. When we see this, we share this with law enforcement. And I will tell you, this individual was arrested. Same thing in Washington State. An individual who is showing his guns, talking about the need to murder Jewish children, the children of other minorities. We come across this every day. I have to be honest with you, this is kind of not remarkable in terms of what we see every day. But sometimes it gets to a different level where we feel we have to share it. So on his gear, he has this symbol that has been co-opted by Nazis. You may have seen that before. Think of the Christchurch shooter. Used that same symbol on his bag, which I'll show in a second. Again, a case where we share this information with law enforcement and they arrest him. Now, that's the good news, right? We're able to identify extremists, share it with law enforcement, and get them off the street, but we cannot account for everybody who is engaging in this activity. Think of all the multitude of platforms. Here's the Christchurch shooter's symbols that he used on his gun and on his bag. These are all indicators that somebody is an extremist. And we all know what he did, right? He basically was signaling back to a community that he was engaged on 8chan, a forum, saying that he's about to commit this attack. Extremists are preparing their social media approach at the same time that they're preparing their weapons. That's modern extremism. When you look at the narrative, the quote-unquote manifesto that he delivers, he very much talks about what Robert Bowers talked about, the browning of this country, what these extremist groups who went to Charlottesville talk about. That's a crisis of mass immigration. They're trying to get rid of the European race or the white race. This is a standard narrative that is being weaponized on social media, on these digital hate groups, that is literally the life's blood of extremism. Now, he cited somebody named Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in Norway. Let me tell you, white supremacy is a global terrorist threat. Because whether it's the New Zealand shooter, whether it's Anders Breivik, they are referring to Americans who inspired them. These people are referring to each other. They're using the same language. And by the way, they're also talking about some of our culture, our pop culture. So in the case of the New Zealand shooter, and frankly in the case of the recent shooting in Poway, within their messages, they refer to PewDiePie. People here know who PewDiePie is? YouTube celebrity. I think he's still the most popular YouTube celebrity around. The Poway shooter referred to Minecraft, the game, again, that my kids play. I don't know if you guys still play Minecraft. But the point is, why would they do that? So that people report on that. Look at these white supremacist shooters talking about PewDiePie, talking about Minecraft. Next time somebody searches for PewDiePie in Minecraft, they're introduced to a world of violence and hate. It's a way to reappropriate these things and introduce younger people to these concepts of hate. This is part of their tactic. They do it on purpose. This word cloud, by the way, is the word cloud of the Poway shooter's so-called letter manifesto. And again, all you have to do is look at the most commonly used terms. European, race, Jews, people, blood. This is standard hate. And we're starting to see this play over and over and over again. A couple last points here. I should note that we're dealing with entire ecosystems, right? So the Pittsburgh shooter, who was on Gab, which is this sort of, fringy platform that is used commonly by white supremacists. He posted 72 times to YouTube. He was sharing videos from that platform. And so my point is that when we're trying to deal with one platform, it's very, very difficult since they're all so interconnected. So, we've talked to various companies about leveraging our expertise, right? We know how they speak, we know the symbols that they use. And the idea is you can train your machines how to identify hate on your platforms and maybe preempt those who want to exploit your services. And A, they need to want to do that, but B, it's not one size fits all. So Facebook and Twitter, and we could talk about the issues on those platforms, are interested in learning from us, but Gab and 8chan, they don't care. So what happens if you somehow purge or remove extremists from one platform? They will all migrate to another. Does that mean we shouldn't try to remove people from websites? I don't know. That's a real discussion we need to have. Because I know that every time there was a purge on Twitter or Facebook, we saw the membership of right-wing sort of fringe platforms like Gab increase. So these are more concentrated echo chambers of hate in which you're sending extremists to. Is that good news or bad news? Point is, we need to consider these things when we respond to extremists on the platforms that they use. Is there a question? Yeah.
We all recognize that social media is a big vehicle for radicalizing people. And so there are websites that will publish all kinds of wrong information, that is anti-Jewish or anti-Hindu or another. And what I do is I look up on Wikipedia on that particular issue and I correct them. So now my question is whether the policy of correcting these people is better or just ignoring them and deleting that post.
It depends who you're correcting. You know what I mean? Like, if you're on Facebook and you have some friends that you're talking to and some of them might be engaging in some sort of narrative that seems to be offensive, I think it's really smart to try to engage and give them the other side. But if you're spending time on Gab or 8chan trying to correct some white supremacists, I would say just get off of that. Don't do that anymore. It's not going to work. And in fact, they're probably trying to troll you. But yes, response is important. And frankly, this is what we need to consider. How do we best respond? I will tell you that there are some dating apps that reached out to us after Charlottesville. They didn't want white supremacists to accidentally date other white supremacists. Or frankly, white supremacists to date non-white supremacists, I think is more accurate. And so I could say, here are all the extremists that we look at, right? And, give them fish, or we can teach them how to fish, right? Educate them. And that's what we try to do. So here are our hate symbols database, which explains every hate symbol that are commonly used by extremists, and we can provide that to these companies so they can train their algorithms to identify that hate speech. And that's the preferred method than trying to just, here's a list of people. And so that's one of the tactics that we use. Now, I want to be respectful of time. I think we're going to have a discussion now. So why don't I stop there, and then we can get into the weeds. I do want to ask just one question.
Shoot.
Anybody recognize what this symbol is?
Oh.
So this is the Identity Europa, that American identitarian movement. Remember him? That's a little symbol on a shirt. Anybody identify this? So this is Bart Simpson's Secret Society in one of the episodes of The Simpsons. It has nothing to do with extremism, but I'm up here and I want to show that. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. I was struck by your presentation for a lot of reasons. I was struck by the fact that there is so much going on in the world, particularly in the online world, that one might not even be aware of, that's having a pretty dramatic impact on communities, even families. And the scale seems so large and overwhelming. And just speaking as one individual, I wonder, what do you do? Don't use the web? How do you exist in a space in which there's so much hate around you, you're not even aware of it?
Yeah, I definitely think sort of retreating into the darkness of your own sort of echo chamber is not the way. This individual said that he corrects people by sharing items on Wikipedia. There's something very simple but true about that. We all have a voice. So when somebody is saying something that is extreme, that is not an extremist, but is similar to the narratives that we see extremists use, we have not only the right, I think it's upon us that we have to call that out. And that also includes our elected officials. We should always use our voice to call out those that are mainstreaming extremism. At the same time, you need to protect yourself online.
Right.
So listen, just check out my Twitter account to see how vile people can get in terms of attacks. And we need to, certainly prepare our kids for what they may experience. But this is where education is key. Right. It's not to say don't go into that space. Right. Anybody who has kids will have an argument about when they can get Snapchat or when they can get Instagram, right? The question is building some resilience in the kids and also teaching them how to be critical thinkers. Don't believe everything that you say, that you see, or that you read. But that's hard. And then frankly, there's what we do, which is try to teach the companies how to fish. You need to understand that you have a problem. You need to admit that you have a problem, and then you need to respond. It is not unreasonable for anybody to say that these companies need to protect their users better from the weaponization of social media and to protect people from the hate that we're seeing play out on the ground. That means having very high, unrealistic standards, even if we have to.
We have a question back there. Would you come forward to the microphone? So,
I was concerned, you talk about who will take the information that you have here. We're already aware that without being told anything about it, Google and others have decided on their own to decide what is hate speech and what is not, and to simply take people off the internet whom they deem. That's why I asked you about criteria for how you're defining some of these things, because I'm very concerned that the media is the internet has having a way of shredding America. And it's very polarizing. There's a lot of potential for the internet, but there's a lot of potential for downright evil and power that is very sub terra. And so I'm educating people on symbols that are widely recognized. Doesn't include some of the censorship that's gone on by Google as they decide what's appropriate and what's not. And there's some very unextreme views which Google has decided are not politically correct. And if there's not a dialogue about this, we're all really going to be in big trouble. So I'm not certain who's going to set the standard of that's the whole basis of free speech, I think. Free speech allows someone to stand up and say things that you disagree with and you might find odious, but you have the ability to actually answer them, just as the gentleman over here suggested. That there is an important in answering.
So let me just say, I think you're right in terms of transparency is key, and that's something we should demand from all these social media platforms is transparency. How are they dealing with hate? How are they defining hate and extremism? So that we can make decisions about whether we want to use their platforms. So transparency is indeed key. At the same time, I think there have been issues where we don't feel like they're doing enough. I believe when Facebook tries to make a differentiation, a distinction between white nationalism and white supremacy, it's a mistake. They said we will allow white nationalism, but we won't allow white supremacy. And we told them there really is no difference. And then they changed the way that they define that. And now they're removing white nationalism and white supremacy, or what they believe that is.
Well, that's that. I
mean,
and
they are private, but here's the deal. They are private companies. So this concept of free speech that we all expect in the public square doesn't really apply to these companies. We expect them to remove pornography for those that are not purely, pornographic sites. We expect them to not allow incitement to violence. And these are the terms that they create. And when they create terms against hate and extremism, they can define that as they want. And we can use our freedom of speech to tell them, we think you need to add this. Or, in some cases, well, I think you're taking a step too far. But they don't owe us anything in the sense that these are private companies and they can make the decisions about what they will and will not allow on their platform.
And I think that's a huge problem we haven't addressed. They have power that is way in excess of the public square.
Thank you for coming to UCI. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I was particularly pleased to see it so data-driven. So thank you, because we like to think that's what we're about here at University of California, Irvine. I wonder if you could push it just a little further. I was intrigued when you talked about what companies are and are not willing to do, and I think it dovetails with this gentleman's comment. And if we could shift it to universities, and I don't want to shift it to the free speech debate. What I want to shift it to is the digital literacy debate. So you mentioned, I think kind of towards the tail end, that I heard you say we need more literacy, being able to discern things on the web. And we, of course, at the university have embraced that. I think there's lots of discussions about literacy and checking sources and deciding what's credible and what's evidence-based and what's not, and what's propaganda and what's someone's opinion and what's best practices, blah, blah, blah. That's our domain. Could you extend your comments and direct them at higher education and universities and what you would like to see us do based on what you see companies doing and not doing, and in recognition of the fact that we're not a company. Our product is the public good. So, thank you.
So in terms of, if I understand the question, what would we like to see universities do in terms of their online sort of approach?
Well, maybe a little more specifically, we have the incredible honor of having young people come before us daily, as a matter of fact. And we're in the education business, and we also we respect free speech and understand kind of robust sets of discussions. What in light of what you see, especially in cyberspace, would you like to see universities doing more or less?
Yeah, well, we were just talking about this earlier. One of the things I would love to see is the creation of authentic content to respond to hate and extremism. I think, if you go onto YouTube and you search for anything, as part of the actual algorithm, you're going to find something extreme within 3 clicks, right? It's intended to keep you on there. And I find in terms, whether it's anti-Semitism or conspiracy theories, there's more of that content than there is the counter messaging, the positive messaging, the response to hatred and bigotry. Just almost, there's very little of that content. And here you have creative people who are spending, at this point, all their lives online. They know how to make a compelling narrative, and it's authentic. And we need to arm them with the ability to tell their stories. In short sound bites, through video. No one's going to read anything. No one's, especially younger people, they're not Googling anything to read. They want the video content. They want the images. And so I think it's creating opportunities for students to tell their stories in a more compelling way, especially through video. I think that's one way to do it.
And I would add that Bill Maher, who we funded through the Confronting Extremism Initiative, has developed this digital toolkit of the right as a way to educate undergraduates about the sources and mechanisms that the right use in the online space. But I think it's real important to sort of provide a type of digital civics education, particularly in light of what you've been describing, because otherwise we don't know what's out there or how it's being used. Maybe you had a question.
A few months ago, the film 1948 Creation Catastrophe was shown at UCI. It achieved its aim of inciting hatred against Jews and Israelis. Clearly, the First Amendment allows showing of the film. The problem is that 3 deans sponsored the showing at UCI, and 2 deans at UCI publicly lauded it. What can we do about such bias and insensitivity?
I wish I was a little bit more familiar with that film. So I'm not sure I totally get the question that there was university-supported film.
University sponsored the showing of the film, which Rabbi called anti-Semitic.
Okay. So the question is, what should the university do?
I think that
It sounds like the university supported it from what you're saying. Again, I would need to get the details of this in order to have an answer. I wouldn't want to, off the cuff, provide an answer if I'm not familiar with the details. Yeah. But I have entree now into some of those folks, so I will make sure I check after this.
Yeah. I think for the most part, if an academic dean sponsors some type of film, it's usually framed in the context of a point of view. And framed in relationship to an audience of experts. But I think that it's part of the campus being a marketplace of ideas. And I don't think that the intention was to sort of engage in what's been characterized. You have a question?
Oh, hi, thank you. I was hoping you could help make a connection for me. You talked earlier in the beginning about normalization of extremism. And I think in the LGBT community, and I think here in Orange County right now, we are experiencing some, I think, terrifying homophobia and transphobia that is being played out in our school districts, in our school boards, that is supported by some of our school board members. And I'm not... I don't think it's minimizing to say that what we're hearing at some of these board meetings, and this is going actually across the state, but really it is, its fruition is here in Orange County, is some of the most vile rhetoric I've heard in a long time, coming from many people, hundreds if not thousands of people. And this is normalized, and it's often allowed. And I'm hoping you can speak to that a little bit, and how we can talk about that and make that connection. Because people talk about it as being part of their religious beliefs, and that it's okay, but it's terrifying. And we know about Blaise Bernstein, and what happened to him, and what's happening here in Orange County, specifically with LGBT youth. So that's one question. And the other is, if you can talk about, are there any common threads between some of these extremists that people have done some research on, what links them together besides being white men? What are some of the other common characteristics that they might have?
So if I understood the first question, what do you do in the face of vile anti-LGBT community hatred? And I would say you speak out against it, you call it out, you expose it. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and then you find allies to support you. To the second part of that first question, which is what happens when it's, sort of religious-based, or, again, anything that's vile, that is uncivil, that feeds into hatred or conspiracies, it needs to be called out. I also think that there are discussions that need to be had between people who have different religious beliefs. And I think that's more of where creating dialogue and creating partnerships or discussions around issues is most important. We tend to stop talking to each other about our significant differences. And so when possible, I know it's not always possible, we should strive for that. Right? I've always thought we need to start twinning cities. Instead of between New York and Moscow, we need to do it between sort of cities on the coast and middle America. Because people have stopped talking to each other about, everything is so polarized. So when possible, dialogue is great, but if somebody is engaging in some sort of hate speech or vile, you've got to call them out. I think that's important. To your second question, which was?
What are some of
the common threads? So I would say it's not all white men, right? I mean, extremism, we look at it across the ideological spectrum. But I think, again, looking to belong to something bigger than yourself is something that we all have. We all want to make sense out of our lives. Some people who are alienated or have a cognitive opening of some sort. they may rely on music or art or their work. Others are finding extremist narratives, those that are answering their questions. And so what we need to do is marginalize that. And maybe that's finding ways to have counter narratives online, not to completely eliminate it, but give people an option, right? I feel like the other question that I got too is more about like, we need to censor the internet and what people are saying. It's just not gonna happen. There's way too many platforms and we're gonna fail if we try. What we need to do is give people alternatives to hear the other point of view and make it as easily accessible. And so that is what is the common theme for people who are getting radicalized. And what I'd like to see is give them more access to fighting hate for good instead of, getting into their rabbit holes of hate.
Hi. I don't know if this, it does work. Great. So thank you once again for coming and talking to us. My question is regarding intervention, because it seems to me, especially based on your presentation, that the ADL is very good at identifying these people. And, even as just a layperson in Irvine and as a UCI student, it's very easy to walk around campus and see everything from some pretty radical anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism from that perspective, as well as graffiti on synagogues and swastikas on synagogues, just in this community over the last 6 months and over the last week. And it seems easy to identify these people. What can we do about it? Because especially in Florida, I know that law enforcement knew about the guy who shot up the school in Florida. And a lot of these extremists are on law enforcement radar, but unfortunately it's not illegal to have a crazy opinion.
Right.
What can we do about this? What can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what used to be called the $64,000 question. Now it's the $1 million question.
I think so.
Again, I think it requires like a holistic approach. So it starts with education. And one of the things that ADL offers is education to young people, peer-to-peer training. And one of the sort of foundations of that training is not only how to identify like stereotyping and bias, but how not to be an innocent bystander, right? These are sort of the lessons from the Holocaust. So at first blush, people need to realize you have a role to play to stand up for those who are being targeted and to speak out when you see it. I actually think that's sort of forgotten. We're sort of seeing this every single day that we forget the fact that we need to call that out and that this is not normal, whether it is in the local community, whether it is in somebody who occupies the highest office, whether it's in our media. We need to start defining our terms again, because I don't even think people know what anti-Semitism is anymore. It's just sort of, become normalized. And that's other forms of bigotry as well. Again, I believe that we can train and create expectations for social media companies about how to deal with these issues. That's where people are getting reached, recruited, and radicalized. And so the degree that we can train them on how to identify and hate and extremism, I think that's important. And some people will say, well, that's censorship. You're teaching them how to identify people online who engage in extremist and hateful ideas, and they're gonna be removed, and that's censorship. I'm sorry, too many people are dying that I think we ought to try. And you know what? If it's too much, trust me, there's gonna be other platforms for people to go, and I would love for those platforms to be increasingly marginalized. Because I don't think that your average user of social media needs to ask that question of, I need to get out of here. Right. I think that these companies should try to protect them from social media being weaponized. That's another thing that we can do. And thirdly, and again, I don't encourage everybody here to be a weekend warrior, to create some sort of false profile online and start hunting Nazis, right? But that's what we do. And frankly, part of that is trying to alert law enforcement to these issues before they happen. I think that's part of the solution as well.
If I may press you just a little bit. My question was more focused on what can we as community members do when there is what, in my view, in the view of, I know many, I can speak for the Jewish community here at UCI, is bona fide anti-Semitism going on, but is not illegal and is not necessarily reportable to law enforcement as a concrete threat. What can we who are in the community that is actively being targeted do in order to protect ourselves short of carrying a gun around?
I think, well, yeah, definitely I would not recommend that.
Yeah.
Listen, if there's
preferably avoidable.
If there's anti-Semitism in this community that you think the administration is not responding to, you got to hold the administration responsible. You got to speak even louder, and you go to organizations like ADL and other organizations and find allies and hold them responsible for not taking it seriously if that's what's happening. The option of just sort of retreating and ignoring it is not there. And so if you're not finding success in speaking out and having an administration in any university, in any campus, who's not being responsible for those needs, you keep doing it until they get it.
Thanks.
Andrew?
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question is kind of related to the previous one. When you're dealing with extremists, what is the best way to make them feel less marginalized?
What was the question? When you're dealing with extremists,
Yeah.
how do you make the extremists feel marginalized?
No, feel less marginalized.
What's less marginalized?
Less marginalized.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, say that.
How do you make them feel less marginalized?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
So, one of the groups that we have worked with is a group of former extremists. And one of the sort of foundational approaches that they use is you need to have compassion for everybody. And, it's one thing if I reached out to an extremist doing what I do, they're probably not going to want to talk to me. They're probably not interested in what I have to say, and I have no authenticity in that space. But somebody who has gone through that radicalization process, somebody who really knows what motivated somebody to get in there, has a unique way of potentially connecting with those who may be going down that path and bringing them back from it. And in fact, Google has, in some ways, tried to use their algorithm to identify people who might be using particular searches that demonstrate a level of extremist interest and redirect them to groups like Life After Hate, a group of former extremists. It's literally called the redirect method. And so I will tell you that we hear from extremists ourselves. They usually contact us because they want to change and they want us to pay for their tattoos to be removed. Or they reach out to us because we misspelled their name on one of our backgrounders. But frankly, for us, we also use that as a referral to these organizations and individuals because they can reach out and offer hope. And I think that is important. You can't just call people out and say you're bad, and some you got to, and hopefully they get arrested. For some who are early on, maybe engaging in these ideas, you got to give them a way out. So thank you for that question.
And I kind of want to push that further, because you're talking about the people who haven't gone there yet. What about bringing someone back from extremism? How do you do that?
Yeah.
What was that?
How do you bring someone back from extremism?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is where you rely on people who have come back from extremism, former extremists who have gone down a specific path and have found a way out, and you have them engage with those folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask something about one of the points you made earlier with violence. You said that violence wasn't the answer, and it's a very simple answer. It's a very factual answer, I would say. That's what everyone says. Can you guys hear me now? There you go. So the point that you made earlier about violence isn't the answer. When I go on Twitter, I see that a lot of, even here on campus, a lot of my peers say, I am done trying to explain my existence to people. I am done trying to explain that I am worthy of existing as a person. And for minorities, that's something that we go through every day. That's something that we may encounter every day. My dad has experienced something like this before. So I just wanted to ask, how do you talk to minorities? How do you talk to our communities and say, this is how we react instead of violence? Because a lot of people on Twitter will say, I'm done trying to explain myself. I'm gonna deck somebody if they try to hurt me, if they, refuse to see me as a human being. So how do you address this within minority communities and say, we're going to combat this a different way instead of feeding into their victimization ideology?
Yeah, I don't know that it's minority communities that are the ones that are using violence to combat the marginalization from extremists more than any other communities. I think as being specifically targeted, it may seem even more immediate, the need to have a reaction, but I would just say this across the board to anybody who wants to combat extremists, no matter what your background is, or even if you feel particularly connected, violence is never the answer. All you're going to do is put yourself in harm's way, feed into the narrative of the extremists, and there are other ways to try to deal with that. We believe that exposing is important. I do believe sunlight is the best disinfectant. You got to call people out. You got to show them, the people around them, what they're doing and what they're saying and why that's false and wrong. But I think when it comes to violence, it's a simple answer. It's just not going to achieve the goal that anybody wants. It's going to make it worse.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks. I'd like to address something a little more mundane than what was so dramatic in your presentation. And it's unique to universities and the academy in general. Mm-hmm. And it's the increasing intellectualization of anti-Semitism that has sort of found itself in describing Israel as a colonialist state, using words like genocide and apartheid to discuss Israeli policy. It starts creeping into cartoons in the international edition of the New York Times, which I know you're familiar with, and sort of creeps into the comments of some people in the halls of Congress. And it is given a veneer by certain institutions and people writing in certain institutions who write under the banner of academic freedom, but it has an insidious and pernicious effect either way, and would like to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I was actually surprised this is the last one that came up. I was expecting that earlier. But listen, I think what we're talking about, or what the focus of my presentation is violent extremism. And that's predicated upon hatred. Hatred of Jews, hatred of Muslims, hatred of LGBTQ community, women, etc. There's also a form of normalizing hatred that we see that is not coming from those who have a proclivity towards violent extremism, right? And I think anti-Semitism and the conflation between Jews and Israelis, we see this happening, as you mentioned, around the country, on television, in the halls in government, and at university and college campuses. There's an ability to create an atmosphere where anti-Semitism is normalized, and I think that's what you're referring to. But I think the response is the same. It might be nuanced. People may not understand it. You need to educate them. We need to call it out and explain why making such comparisons between, say, Jews and Israelis is anti-Semitism, right? You can be critical of Israeli policy without necessarily casting a cloud against the Jewish community per se. I think there's all sorts of ways in which we see anti-Israel rhetoric sort of cross the line into anti-Semitism. And frankly, yeah, it's our job to educate people. And where that crosses the line, we need to, again, call that out where we see it. We're not afraid to do that at ADL. I know that when you're in a community in which it's happening, it's more perhaps intense, but this is where we can help. And so I see it happening. I see it happening all the time, but that's a form of hatred that we can speak out against. And by the way, there's nuances in all forms of bigotry that play out in ways that we don't always understand, and it's that same approach every time.
This evening has been particularly important for the information that Oren has shared with us about the state of hate. I think there's a few takeaways. 1, get educated. 2, call things out. And 3, something that's been implied, but I think it's particularly important, form coalitions. Because if we're standing up together, it's a lot easier to confront hate and extremism rather than regarding it as something that's too big and too far away for each of us. And so on behalf of the campus, I want to thank Oren Segal for coming. Please join me and give him a hand. Thank you. Appreciate it.